Have you ever watched someone slowly disappear from people's lives? Maybe it was a friend who stopped replying to messages, maybe a coworker who quietly left the group chats, or maybe someone you know suddenly distanced themselves from nearly everyone, friends, relatives, acquaintances, almost like they pressed a reset button on their social life. And from the outside, it can look confusing, sometimes even dramatic. People might say things like, they're too sensitive, or they can't handle relationships, or they just push everyone away. But psychology often tells a very different story, because when someone cuts people off, especially many people at once, it's rarely random, it's rarely simple, and it's almost never just about being cold or antisocial. In many cases, it's the result of something much deeper happening inside the mind. Let me paint a familiar scene. Imagine someone sitting in their room late at night. Their phone lights up with messages, a group chat buzzing with jokes, plans, casual conversations. On the surface, everything looks normal, but inside their mind, the experience feels very different. They're thinking about the last conversation they had with a friend that felt strangely one-sided. They're remembering a moment where someone dismissed their feelings with a quick laugh. They're replaying a small comment that seemed harmless to everyone else, but didn't feel harmless to them. And slowly, a quiet realization begins forming. Maybe these relationships aren't what they thought they were. For some people, that thought passes quickly. They brush it off and move on. But for others, the thought grows louder. Psychology has an interesting way of describing this process. It's often connected to something called emotional boundary awareness. This is the moment when someone begins recognizing how certain relationships affect their mental and emotional well-being. And once you see it, it's very hard to unsee it. Think about it like discovering that a small crack exists in the wall of your house. At first, it seems minor, easy to ignore. But once you notice it, your brain keeps returning to it. You start seeing where the crack spreads. You start wondering how long it's been there. You start questioning whether the foundation was ever stable in the first place. Relationships can feel similar. Many people go through life tolerating things that don't actually feel good. Small, disrespectful comments, friendships that feel more draining than supportive, conversations that leave them feeling unseen or misunderstood. And for a long time, they simply accept it as normal. But eventually, something shifts. Sometimes it's a single event. Sometimes it's years of accumulated experiences. Sometimes it's personal growth that suddenly changes the way they see the people around them. Suddenly, they're asking questions they never asked before. Why do I feel exhausted after talking to this person? Why do some friendships feel like obligations instead of connections? Why do I keep making excuses for behavior that doesn't feel right? When those questions begin appearing, the brain enters a kind of emotional reevaluation phase. Psychologists sometimes describe this as cognitive reframing. It's when your mind reinterprets past experiences through a new perspective. Moments that once seemed small begin looking different. That joke that always made you uncomfortable, that friend who only calls when they need something, that pattern of conversations where your thoughts never seem to matter quite as much. Once your brain starts connecting those dots, it becomes difficult to return to the old version of the relationship. And for some people, the response becomes distance. Not always dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's quiet. Messages become shorter, invitations become rarer, conversations become less personal. Eventually, the connection fades entirely. From the outside, people often misunderstand this shift. They see someone withdrawing and assume the person has become distant, unfriendly, or emotionally closed. But inside that person's mind, something very different might be happening. They might actually be protecting themselves. Let's talk about something interesting about human psychology. Your brain constantly monitors emotional safety, not just physical safety, but emotional safety as well. When you're around people who respect you, listen to you, and make you feel valued, your brain relaxes. Social interaction feels energizing. But when you're around people who create tension, criticism, manipulation, or subtle disrespect, your brain interprets that as a kind of threat. Not a dramatic threat like danger in the wild, but a social threat. And social threats activate stress responses. That's why some conversations leave you feeling strangely drained even if nothing obviously went wrong. Your nervous system noticed something your conscious mind might not have fully recognized yet. Now imagine someone who experiences this pattern repeatedly. Over time, their brain begins forming a powerful association. Certain people equal emotional exhaustion. Certain environments equal stress. Eventually, the brain reaches a conclusion that feels surprisingly logical. Maybe it would be healthier to step away. This is where the behavior people call cutting people off often begins. But here's something important that rarely gets discussed. People who cut others off are not always trying to isolate themselves. Often, they're trying to stop tolerating patterns that once felt unavoidable. Think about someone who spends years being the emotional support for everyone else, the person everyone goes to when they're struggling, the one who listens, helps, comforts, solves problems. But when that same person needs support, the room suddenly becomes quiet. Over time, that imbalance can create deep emotional fatigue. Psychologists sometimes call this compassion burnout, when someone gives emotional energy constantly but receives very little in return. At some point, the brain begins asking a painful question: who is there for me? If the answer feels uncertain, distance can begin to look like self-preservation. Another interesting factor is personal growth. When people go through major periods of self-reflection, therapy, learning, or emotional development, their perception of relationships often changes. The person you were 5 years ago might have tolerated behaviors that the present version of you no longer accepts. It's a bit like upgrading your glasses and suddenly realizing the world looks sharper. Things you once overlooked become visible. Some people grow alongside you. Others remain exactly where they were. And that difference in direction can quietly create distance. This doesn't necessarily mean anyone is bad. It simply means the relationship dynamic no longer fits who you've become. But society tends to send a confusing message about this. We often hear that loyalty means keeping people in your life no matter what, that cutting people off is selfish or immature. Yet psychology suggests that boundaries are one of the most important components of emotional health. A boundary is not a punishment, it's a limit that protects your well-being. Sometimes a boundary is a conversation, sometimes it's creating space, and sometimes it's walking away entirely. Of course, cutting people off isn't always the healthiest solution either. In some situations, it can come from avoidance, unresolved pain, or fear of confrontation. Human behavior is rarely simple. But when someone carefully chooses distance after years of emotional strain, it can also be a sign that they're finally listening to their own needs. Interestingly, people who take this step go through a complicated emotional phase afterwards. At first, there might be relief, the absence of tension, the quiet feeling of having reclaimed mental space. But there can also be loneliness. Even unhealthy relationships leave emotional imprints, memories, shared experiences, familiar routines. Letting go of people, even when it's necessary, can still hurt. It's a bit like leaving a house that once felt like home, but slowly became uncomfortable. You know it was the right decision, yet a part of you still remembers the good moments. Over time, something interesting tends to happen. Once someone removes relationships that consistently drain them, they often begin noticing the difference in their emotional energy. They feel calmer, more focused, less obligated to perform versions of themselves that never felt authentic. And that emotional space creates room for something new. Healthier friendships, more honest conversations, connections that feel mutual rather than exhausting. Because the truth is, when your life is filled with relationships that constantly take energy away, it becomes difficult to recognize what supportive relationships actually feel like. Sometimes distance is what allows that contrast to become visible. And that brings us to an important perspective shift. When you see someone who has distanced themselves from many people, it's easy to assume they've become antisocial. But sometimes what you're actually witnessing is someone rebuilding their emotional environment. They're learning which relationships nurture them and which ones slowly deplete them. They're learning that not every connection needs to last forever. And they're realizing that protecting their peace isn't the same as rejecting humanity. In fact, it often leads to deeper, more meaningful connections with the right people. Because when your life is filled with relationships that constantly take energy away, it becomes difficult to recognize what supportive relationships actually feel like. Sometimes distance is what allows that contrast to become visible. And that brings us to an important perspective shift. When you see someone who has distanced themselves from many people, it's easy to assume they've become antisocial. But sometimes what you're actually witnessing is someone rebuilding their emotional environment. They're learning which relationships nurture them and which ones slowly deplete them. They're learning that not every connection needs to last forever. And they're realizing that protecting their peace isn't the same as rejecting humanity. In fact, it often leads to deeper, more meaningful connections with the right people. Because when your life is filled with relationships that constantly take energy away, it becomes difficult to recognize what supportive relationships actually feel like. Sometimes distance is what allows that contrast to become visible. And that brings us to an important perspective shift. When you see someone who has distanced themselves from many people, it's easy to assume they've become antisocial. But sometimes what you're actually witnessing is someone rebuilding their emotional environment. They're learning which relationships nurture them and which ones slowly deplete them. They're learning that not every connection needs to last forever. And they're realizing